Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on the tank rankings for all specializations in Dragonflight. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. And we'll start like we always do by looking at last week's rankings. We are at the end of week 8 right now in season 1. These are the statistics from last week, week 7 in season 1. A bit of a disclaimer here, tank is probably the hardest specialization or role to rank just because it's kind of amorphous to rank them. You look at different statistics, death rate, heal rate, damage reduced, damage taken, damage dealt, but there's not really like a clear winner on how best to rank them. So I'm just looking at the overall, which parses had the best overall performance and what tanks were being brought in that and how did they perform collectively. So this is the ranking from last week, and this is actually not too dissimilar from where it's been the whole season, but with 10.0.5 now 2 weeks in the books, we've seen some people experiment with Brewmaster and some new things coming up. So let's take a look at week 8's numbers for tanks. And here we are, week 8 tank rankings. And you better believe there's a couple things in here that made my jaw drop. I was not expecting things to end up this way in week 8, the second week after 10.0.5. But here we are. Again, the same thing that I'd said last week for week 7. I think that the tanks are actually in a pretty good spot right now overall. You can see the curvature of their lines. There's no major deviations. You could probably argue that Brewmaster, Blood, and Protection Warrior are in an echelon slightly above Vengeance Guardian and Protection Paladin. But in general, I think they're in a relatively good spot balance-wise. And we're also seeing some pretty major buffs to Guardian, Druid, and Protection Paladin coming in the reset on Tuesday. So pretty cool stuff there. Let's go through the list and talk about where the tanks are now. At the top, as has been unshaken since the entirety of Season 1 Dragonflight, is Protection Warrior. No major surprises there. They do incredible damage. They have insane amounts of Absorb with their Ignore Pain. They have a lot of buttons for every possible scenario. They are great with magic. They can even deal damage with Spell Reflect and Spell Block. They have lots of high parry, high armor, and ways to kind of deal with all of it. They even have some really cool raid cooldowns, which are pretty nice to deal with. So overall, their total is going to be at the very top. They are actually 3rd overall when it comes to Heroic Raid. Mythic Raid, they are being brought the most and being utilized the best, and the same thing goes for Mythic Plus. And that's kind of been the case. In difficult content, almost everyone is bringing Protection Warriors regardless, and that's just been the case. And until we see major changes, we'll see what happens going into the next update. It's possible they may lose their number 1 slot, but here's where we're at with that. Brewmaster has received a lot of buffs over the last 8 weeks. One of the major ones, they ripped 15 seconds off their Celestial Brew. They got some crazy armor stacking. They got some really nice reworks to damage, which ended up, I think, being better for them overall and gave them more threat generation, which is pretty cool. And this week in Heroic Raid, they were the number 1 tank. I think this is probably because, so let me put it this way. Brewmaster is probably the best tank if you have a tank that's getting hit really hard all the time. I think Brewmaster performs best when they can get to red stagger and stay there for long periods of time, because then their Purifying Brews are exceptionally good. Their Celestial Brews are exceptionally good, insane. They can get up to really high stacks very easily. They can get these giant absorbs, and it works really well. When you bring a Brewmaster into medium difficulty or easy difficulty, they're probably one of the worst tanks because they don't have enough stagger to play around with, and it's much harder for them to excel. So in Heroic Raid, it's possible that they run, maybe they're just running like 5 stacks of concussive or swapping very late and then just getting crazy parses on Brewmaster. But Brewmaster, one of the best tanks to bring in Heroic Raid this week. In Mythic Raid, they were still underneath the Protection Warrior and the Blood DK. And we had a bit of shock this week with Guardian Druid being the 2nd best tank in Mythic Raid. This one, I talked about this in the DPS video. For some reason, I feel like when we're in farm, like when we're farming, like we've already cleared the tier, most mythic guilds are kind of just farming, building alts, preparing for next season, preparing for next tier. They tend to just experiment a bunch. They tend to just pick whatever is unpopular, push it as high as they can. They get bored and they're like, okay, let's bring 2 Guardian Druids this week and see what we can get. And oftentimes that mentality finds its way into the data that we see here for Mythic Raid. It's showing up every week in all roles, every situation. You know, Mistweaver gets a buff, you see him a lot. Ret Paladin gets a buff, you see him a lot. In Mythic Raid, it doesn't seem to show up as much or as commonly in Heroic Raid or Mythic Plus, because I think people pug that a lot more. But in Mythic Raid, there seems to be a trend going on with that. So this week, Mythic Raid, Guardian Druid was second best, but you can see with their Mythic Plus and Heroic Raid still towards the bottom overall. So it could be just the best guilds are doing everything they can. They're bored and they're trying to figure out what they can get out of Guardian, and it ended up being a lot more than most people thought. Brewmaster being 4th in Mythic Raid and 2nd in Mythic Plus. Again, I think the major reason for that is Brewmaster, if they can get to Red Stagger regularly, which if you're doing a plus 22 or a plus 23 or plus 24, they can stay at Red Stagger all the time, 24/7. They can get insane absorbs, they can get insane purifies, and everything kind of stacks up that way. So I'm not surprised to see them where they are, especially with all the buffs that they've gotten. In 3rd place is Blood DK. Blood DK and Prot Warrior have been in the 1st, 2nd slot fighting for it all this whole time. This is the first time we've seen Brewmaster push Blood down. So kind of shocking overall, but Blood's still doing exceptionally well. Heroic Raid, they're 2nd best, 3rd best in Mythic Raid, and 4th best in Mythic Plus. And I think they actually probably will jump up a bit in Mythic Plus, because going into the reset, they are getting a major damage buff. All of their core abilities are getting major damage increases, and you do need a lot of damage coming out from your tanks in Mythic Plus and your healers to be able to clear the key on time. So it could be that that's just helping out with that overall. So I'm excited to see kind of where Blood DKs end up. They are about where they've been overall, but you know, slipping a little bit of Mythic Plus, and maybe with the changes to damage output, that will change. In the 4th overall slot is Vengeance Demon Hunter. They have been in the middle this whole time. They've been kind of just sitting in the middle chilling. As other specs go up and down, they're just in the middle, just hanging out. In Heroic Raid, they're 4th overall. In Mythic Raid, they are 5th overall, 5th overall, and then Mythic Plus, they're 5th overall. So they actually do okay in medium to normal difficulty content. When the difficulty goes up, Vengeance Demon Hunter, at least this week, is showing that they buckle quite easily, almost similarly to Guardian Druid. So shockingly enough, they seem to be doing worse after 10.0.5 than they had been before. And as the difficulty scales up, they're being brought less and utilized less. Yeah, I mean, you can make your predictions on why that is. It could be that they just have less buttons and they rely a lot on their parry potential and their natural fragment building for self-healing. They don't really have, it's not like Protection Warrior where you have this massive kit of all these choices to make. It's like, do you have spikes up? Yes. Do you have sigil ready? Okay. Do you have meta? Okay, we'll use meta. Are you using cheat death? Okay, did that go? Heal yourself. That immolation's running. Like, they don't have a crazy amount of buttons to run or this like really unique mechanic like you do with Stagger. So I think it just comes down to passive. You might just want to give them maybe a little bit more armor or a little bit more parry, or buff some of their core talents to give them a little bit more. But it does seem like they have slipped a little bit from last week to this week and since 10.0.5. The 5th overall tank is Guardian Druid, shockingly enough, mostly just because Mythic guilds have been pushing Guardian Druid this week for whatever reason. They just wanted to see where Guardian would go. They got new talents, they got new builds. They're trying to use like TNC and Rake and get what they can out of it, or raise, get whatever they can out of it, and that has brought their score up. If not for that, they would be easily in the last slot. As you can see with Mythic Plus, they're at the bottom, and for Heroic Raid, they are 2nd to last, quite close to that last slot. And for probably, I mean, Guardian Druid and Protection Paladin were kind of fighting for that last slot. This week, Protection Paladin is actually in the lowest overall, primarily because of their raid performance. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that in general, Blizzard buffs around raid, so it's pretty obvious why Protection Paladin's getting some buffs going into the reset on Tuesday. So we're seeing that show up, which is really nice. And then in Mythic Plus, I think they tend to do okay because they have great AoE. They have good utility that works really well in high keys. And in general, they can keep their mitigations rolling in Mythic Plus, especially when they're being attacked. I think that's a big part of it, is that if you don't have aggro, it's a little bit harder for them to build holy power and build defense, keep their Shield of Righteous up, and kind of rotate through that. So I guess, you know, when they're swapping with another tank in raid, they tend to do much worse than they would otherwise. So, you know, there's that. But in Mythic Plus, they do well. So if you're Prop Paladin, a buff coming this week on Tuesday, the reset. So we'll see them rise, hopefully in raid. And then in Mythic Plus, they're still doing just fine. I wouldn't worry about them. You know, grab your Sentinel, get going, and you're good to go there. So that's where the tanks line up this week. Kind of shocking with Guardian Druid showing up much higher in Mythic Raid. A little shocking to see Vengeance start to slip a little bit. Brewmaster doing insanely well. Brewmaster stonks are through the roof. Blood DK is probably going to jump up again after the buffs they're getting on Tuesday. And then we're probably at a point where we need to talk about maybe some Vengeance buffs for Demon Hunter in general. I mean, they are kind of in the middle, but in a way that I would say is not kind of fitting of their class and spec. You know, I think they probably do need a little bit of love going into future updates. So we'll see where that goes. But that's it for me today. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content. Link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.